At the height of Chinese civilization under the Tang Dynasty, foreign religious and cultural influences from across Eurasia were widely adopted into Chinese culture. This was the period in which Buddhism rose to prominence in China, and many aspects of fashion, cuisine, music, dance, and architecture were influenced from foreigners who came to settle in the Tang Empire. Notable among these were what are known as the Three Persian Religions: Zoroastrianism, Manicheaism, and Christianity in the form of the Church of the East. After the conquest of Sassanid Persia by the Muslims, many Persians settled in China and made it their new home. Many assimilated into the local population, while others maintained their distinct identities in an attempt to preserve the cultural traditions of the homeland which they lost. Manichaeism in particular, one of the most widespread religions in the world at the time, continued to flourish in China long after it had gone extinct in its land of origin of Persia. And similarly, Zoroastrianism and Christianity both found China to be a tolerant land that allowed for the continued practice and propagation of their faiths. The tale of the three Persian religions in China is a fascinating, though often obscure, history. That's why, when I saw their depiction in the trailer for a Chinese historical drama, I knew I had to check it out for myself, to see just how historically accurate their portrayal was. The Longest Day in Chang'an is a masterpiece in every regard. The music, costume designs, set, characters, and overall story as a whole paints a magnificent portrait of what it might have felt like to walk the streets of Chang'an at the height of the Tang Dynasty in the mid-8th century. This is accomplished by telling the story through the lives of the everyday citizens, and not just through court officials and members of the nobility, but more importantly the common folk as well. You get to see the world through the perspective of all characters involved in the plot, and really begin to emphasize with their motives as the show progresses, even the antagonists. This video analysis will contain spoilers for the plot of The Longest Day in Chang'an, so if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out first before coming back to this video. It's freely available to watch on YouTube, so you should have no problem finding it. I'll leave a link in the description. The story takes place during the third year of the Tianbao era, which should correlate to around 744 AD in the Gregorian calendar. While not based on any real historical event, many of the characters are actual historical figures, though of course their stories have been heavily fictionized. The Tianbao era was the end of the golden age of the Tang Dynasty, and was a time when people from all around the world came to live and work in the city of Chang'an, as it was the endpoint of the Silk Road. It is believed that around 5% of the city's population was of foreign origin, which may not seem like a lot, but in a city with over 1 million people, this translated to being tens of thousands of people. The show does an excellent job in showcasing the city's diversity, with characters such as Ge Lao and the Japanese architects. Ge Lao is a former Kunlun slave, who were dark-skinned slaves imported to China from Southeast Asia and Africa during the Tang Dynasty, while the Japanese architect is a nod to the fact that many Japanese came to live in China at the time, and based the layout of Japanese cities such as Nara and Kyoto on Chang'an. But what I find even more interesting, though perhaps less historically accurate, was the drama's portrayal of foreign religious groups that were present in China at the time. Most notable in the show was the presence of the Zoroastrian community at Huaiyuan Street, as well as the Christian church where we meet the friar Yisi. While I certainly appreciate the acknowledgement that these religions existed in China under the Tang Dynasty, there were quite a few historical inaccuracies that we should discuss. Now, to my disappointment, Manichaeism did not make an appearance in The Longest Day in Chang'an, despite the fact that it was the most popular of the three Persian religions in China. Actually, when I first saw the show, I was under the assumption that the community at Huaiyuan Street were actually Manichaeans and not Zoroastrians. It wasn't until the episode with Yu Chang's flashback, when she meets a woman praising Ahura Mazda, that I realized these people were actually supposed to be Zoroastrians. So let me explain my confusion. Zoroastrianism in China was not highly popular among the Han Chinese themselves, and most of its adherents were Persian and Sogdian foreigners. In the drama, however, most of the Zoroastrians seemed to be ethnically Han Chinese, though perhaps this was just a casting decision, because all these Zoroastrians who don't have their faces covered by a veil have a more foreign appearance to them. But in any case, Manicheaism, unlike Zoroastrianism, was popular among the Han Chinese themselves, and eventually most of its practitioners came to be native Han Chinese and not foreigners. That was the main reason I assumed that the Huaiyuan community were meant to be Zoroastrians. Otherwise, the overall appearance of the community in terms of their dress, the Ahura Mazda symbol on the archpriest, and the emphasis on fire all give off strong Zoroastrian vibes. I will say that I'm pretty sure that the archpriest's request to have Zhang Xiaojing walk through flames to determine his purity is made up, though correct me if I'm wrong. This is because if Zhang Xiaojing wasn't pure, he would burn up, which is a big no in Zoroastrianism. Fire is a sacred symbol to Zoroastrians, and thus having it burn up a dead body is seen as contamination. Because of this, Zoroastrians traditionally lay out their dead on a structure known as the Tower of Silence, where the body would be eaten by vultures, since cremation would contaminate fire, while burial would contaminate the earth. The veils worn by the Zoroastrian community are also meant to prevent contamination, and many depictions of Sogdians and Persians in Chinese artwork depict them wearing these types of veils, which are still worn by Zoroastrians today. As I mentioned earlier, Zoroastrianism didn't make Chinese converts or translate their scriptures into Chinese, despite being present in China as early as the 4th century. Because of this, it disappeared from China after the persecution of foreign religions by Emperor Wuzong, which took place about 100 years after the Tianbao era. Manicheaism, on the other hand, did gain many Chinese converts, and translated their scriptures into the Chinese language. It was also highly popular among the Uyghurs, many of which came to live in China at the time. Manicheaism is believed to have arrived in the Tang Dynasty around 694 AD, which is late compared to other foreign religions. Despite this, it assimilated much more easily than every other religion, second only to Buddhism. This is probably due in part to the religion's cosmology, which emerged as a mix between different religions, and thus had an easier time adapting to pre-existing Chinese religions such as Taoism. Manicheaism regarded the Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus all as important prophetic figures who are regarded as previous incarnations of the religion's main prophet, Mani. When it entered China, the Manicheans began to teach that Laozi, the Taoist sage, was another of Mani's previous incarnations. This led them to be on good terms with the Taoists, though they often clashed with the Buddhists and were regarded as a heretical offshoot. Manicheaism, unlike Zoroastrianism, also managed to survive in China after Emperor Wuzong's persecution of foreign religions, and this was due to widespread adherence among the Han Chinese, an ability to syncretize and assimilate into Chinese culture, both of which Zoroastrianism was unable to do. Manicheaism was heavily indigenized and assimilated into Chinese culture after the expulsion of foreigners, becoming heavily syncretized with Buddhism by the Ming Dynasty. In fact, the White Lotus movement, which was part of the Red Turban Rebellion that toppled the Yuan and established the Ming Dynasty, was a syncretic religious movement between Buddhism and Manicheaism. Although Manicheaism eventually was completely assimilated into Chinese Buddhism, there is actually a temple today in the city of Quanzhou, which has a statue of the prophet Mani that has been modified over the centuries to resemble a Buddha. There are actually some claims that Manicheaism is still practiced in China today, though this hasn't been confirmed by any scholars. Yi Si is one of the characters who actually is based on a real historical figure, and retains the same name as his historical counterpart. His Persian name was Yazdabozid, and while he wasn't a Persian prince like the Yi Si in the drama, he was the son of a priest from Balkh in modern Afghanistan, who settled in China during the 7th century. During the Tianbao era, he joined a battalion which helped put down the Anlushan rebellion. For this, he earned the respect of the emperor. Yi Si's son was named Adam, or Jing Jing in Chinese, and recorded the history of Christianity in China on the Xi'an stele, which was rediscovered 1,000 years later by the Jesuits in the 17th century. Adam is also believed to be the author of some of the Jingjiao documents, also known as the Jesus Sutras. These were manuscripts written in Chinese that adopted Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist terminology in an attempt to explain Christianity in a familiar manner to the Chinese. In the show, it is mentioned that the monks at the Persian monastery come from all over the world, Persia, Rome, Japan, and many other countries. While there are no historical records showing any Europeans or Japanese Christians present in China at the time, there are claims among some that Christianity did exist in Japan during the Tang Dynasty. The Keikyo Institute is one example of this, claiming that Christians from the Church of the East arrived in Japan as early as the 5th century, though this theory hasn't been widely accepted by scholars. Although most people in the show refer to Yise as a Persian monk, he corrects them on numerous occasions, stating that their church is actually a Roman church and calls it Catholic. Now, Roman Catholicism didn't enter China until after the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, which is 500 years after the events depicted in the show. But the term Catholic does not just refer to Roman Catholics. The Patriarch of the Church of the East, as well as other Eastern churches such as the Armenians, is known as the Catholicos, derived from a Greek term meaning universal. The Catholic Church itself simply means universal church, and so it's not a title that is exclusively applied to the Roman Catholic Church, as many other churches also claim to be Catholic as well. And in the mid-8th century, when the Church of the East had spread as far as China and India, it was by far the most geographically widespread church in the world at the time, and therefore most fitting to be called the Universal Church. It is also mentioned that Yise went to the palace on several occasions to teach scripture to the emperor. While there aren't records of the historical Yise doing this, it is true that emperors did patronize the Church of the East, allowing them to build churches and monasteries across the country. When Christianity first arrived in China in 635 AD, the Assyrian missionary Alopen translated scripture into Chinese, which were studied by Emperor Taizong. As depicted in the show, most of the Christians in China at the time were indeed foreigners, although they would have primarily been Persian, Turkic, and Assyrian in origin, not European, which the actors playing the monks primarily seem to be. The actor playing Isa, Aldos Farouk, is actually a Uyghur himself, and it is true that Christianity was practiced by Uyghurs at the time, most notably in the kingdom of Gocho. Isa claims to be a descendant of a Persian royal family, and it actually is historically accurate that Persian princes sought refuge in China after the Muslim conquest, and had a strong connection to the Church of the East. Yazdegerd III was the last Shah of the Sassanids, and although he was a Zoroastrian, it is said that after the Muslim conquest of Persia, his Christian subjects remained more loyal to him than even the Iranian nobility did. He sought refuge in the city of Merv, located in modern-day Turkmenistan, which at the time was a major center of trade and learning along the Silk Road, home to a large Christian community. According to tradition, Yazdegerd was buried by Elias, the bishop of Merv, who performed the last rites on the Shah and on the great Sassanid Empire. Yazdegerd's sons, Peroz and Bahram, fled to China in exile, seeking asylum under the Tang Dynasty. They managed to convince the Tang court to send an army with them back to Persia, with the hope that they'd be able to reconquer their homeland from the Muslims, but this was never successful. As with Zoroastrianism, the Church of the East didn't manage to attract a large number of Chinese converts, despite the translation of Christian scripture into Chinese. This proved to be detrimental for the survival of Christianity in China after they lost the emperor's patronage in the 9th century, resulting in their eventual persecution and expulsion from the country alongside the Zoroastrians. Islam and Judaism were also practiced in China during the Tang Dynasty, though were much less visible than the Three Persian Religions. According to tradition, Islam arrived in the port city of Guangzhou from the companions of Muhammad, while Judaism arrived perhaps as early as the Han Dynasty, after the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. Like Christianity and Zoroastrianism, Islam and Judaism were practiced primarily by foreigners, and it wouldn't be until the Ming Dynasty that they started assimilating into Chinese culture, forming the Hui Muslim and Kaifeng Jewish communities, which still exist to this day, and trace their roots back to foreigners who settled in China centuries ago, who intermarried with the local Chinese population. The Great Mosque of Xi'an is said to have been founded during the Tianbao era, and while there aren't any depictions of Muslims or Jews in the show, we do get the usage of an Islamic term, the Zhueluhuoduo, or in Arabic, Jahannam Dul. The characters in the show translate this as meaning inferno, and in Islam itself, Jahannam is the Arabic name for hell. Despite the usage of a Muslim term and the fact that the leader of the wolf squad disguised himself as a Christian monk, there is no other indication that the members of the wolf squad themselves are Christians or Muslims. They seem to come from a country on the borders of the Tang Empire, which could be any number of small nomadic kingdoms or states to the north or west of China. By this point, Islam hadn't yet spread widely among the nomadic Turkic peoples of Central Asia, and although Christianity was practiced among some, it wouldn't be until later centuries that these two religions would become much more widespread in the region. Between 841 and 845 AD, about a century after the events depicted in the drama, Emperor Wu Zong launched the Huichang persecution of Buddhists, which targeted not only Buddhism but all foreign religious communities, including Zoroastrianism, Manicheaism, and Christianity. There were numerous reasons for this persecution, as the Tang Dynasty had gradually grown more and more hostile to foreigners and their culture over time. Buddhism was by far the most widespread foreign religion, and since it had only begun rising to prominence in China during the Tang era, it still hadn't fully assimilated into society, and thus was regarded as incompatible with Chinese culture in many ways. Emperor Wuzhong had become a devout follower of Taoism, which emphasized immortality, while Buddhism, on the other hand, emphasized breaking free of the cycle of rebirth in order to attain nirvana. This was perceived as being in complete opposition to Chinese ideals. Buddhism also faced opposition from the Confucian elites, due to its encouragement of its followers to leave their families and seek a monastic lifestyle. Of course, Confucianism's greatest ideal is focused on the structure of society and the family. The relationship between father and son and subjects and rulers is seen as integral to the survival of Chinese civilization, and thus Buddhism's rejection of this was unacceptable. Other than ideological, there were also political motivations behind the opposition to Buddhism. Buddhist monasteries had become extremely wealthy over the course of the Tang era due to their tax-exempt status, and were known for money lending and the usage of slave labor, and thus were frowned upon by much of the rest of society. Because of this, Emperor Wuzhong ordered monks and nuns to turn over their wealth to the government. But over time, he became more intolerant of Buddhism, and rather than seeking to reform it, he sought to eradicate it completely. Monks and nuns were ordered to give up the monastic life and return to society as regular citizens, and many temples and shrines were destroyed. The Three Persian Religions were not spared from this persecution, as they were regarded as heretical forms of Buddhism. And while Buddhism was able to persist in China due to it being much more widespread and practiced primarily by the Han Chinese, Zoroastrianism and Christianity quickly disappeared once the foreigners were expelled from the country. The last major wave of persecution, and most dramatic, came in the form of the Guangzhou Massacre of 878 to 879 AD. This came about after a rebel leader named Huang Chao seized control of the city, which was home to a large number of foreign merchants. Arab sources indicate that up to 200,000 foreigners were massacred, primarily Arabs and Persians, though this number is most likely exaggerated. Regardless, it was a devastating blow that targeted not only Zoroastrians and Christians like the earlier waves of persecution did, but also Muslims and Jews as well. 100 years later, a monk of the Church of the East reported, "Christianity is extinct in China. The native Christians have perished in one way or another. The church has been destroyed, and there is only one Christian left in this land." While these foreign religions would later return to China following the Mongol conquests in the 13th century, there are no sources describing the continuation of Christian practice in China for nearly 400 years. However, gravestones have been discovered dating to the Song and Liao dynasties, indicating that perhaps Christian communities did manage to survive in China even after the Tang Dynasty's collapse. In conclusion, The Longest Day in Chang'an depicts the midpoint of the Tang Dynasty, a golden era of cultural flourishing, although under later dynasties China would open up its borders again to foreign influence, this would never be to the same extent as it had been under the Tang. After this point, Zoroastrianism would disappear from China completely, and Manicheaism would go into a centuries-long decline, from which it would never recover, eventually fading into obscurity. Even Buddhism has arguably never reached the same level of prominence in China as it once had during the Tang era. And Christianity, though more widespread in China today than it has ever been before, would have to be introduced to the country several more times in various forms before it finally became widespread among the Han Chinese themselves. And the Church of the East, the earliest form of Christianity which arrived in the country, has completely disappeared from the land, and was all but forgotten until the discovery of the Xi'an stele nearly a millennia after the faith first arrived in the country. It is from the few surviving sources we have from this era that we learn of the story of the foreign faiths which once flourished during the Tang era. The Three Persian Religions were at one point some of the most widespread religious traditions in the world. But since the days of the Great Tang, Manicheaism is completely extinct, and Zoroastrianism and the Church of the East have gone into a steep decline, today only practiced by a few 100,000 adherents in small pockets of communities around the world. Despite this, their stories should not be forgotten. The Longest Day in Chang'an gives us a glimpse at the once vibrant history of the Three Persian Religions in Chinese history, which is a rare but much appreciated depiction of foreign religious influence in Chinese culture. And if you're interested, I have some novels which actually make references to these communities. My story, 10,000 Lights, takes place in an alternate universe where China never reunified after the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. The novel's setting is a kingdom where foreign influence remains present in China all those centuries later, including practitioners of the Three Persian Religions who are descended from those who arrived during the Tang era. If you're interested, check out my novels 10,000 Lights and End of Serenity, link in description. And thank you for watching.